Zainbai, they say a kingdom reflects the soul of its king, but what happens when the soul at the throne is rotten, diseased with obsession, cruelty, and unspeakable lust? Madrid, 1832. The royal palace was silent except for the cries behind a velvet-draped chamber door. A girl, barely 13, screamed into a gag as iron cuffs tightened around her wrists. On the other side of the room, a man, bloated with age, decadence, and power, watched with the dead eyes of a man who no longer saw human beings, only playthings. That man was Ferdinand Roman VII, King of Spain, and what history chose to forget we will remember. By the time of his fourth marriage, Ferdinand's health was failing, but his desires were not. Doctors whispered of syphilitic decay, of a body falling apart under its own lustful weight. Priests begged him to repent. Servants averted their eyes from the ever. Younger girls brought through hidden corridors, but no one stopped him, not the church, not the court, not the people, because the monster wore a crown. And in his court, suffering became spectacle, pain became power, and perversion became policy. Tonight, we'll walk through the palaces of this forgotten tyrant. We will descend into the velvet-covered rot. And we will uncover how one of history's most perverted monarchs turned the Spanish throne into a theater of sadism. But I must warn you, this story is not for the faint of heart. What you are about to hear is documented, buried, and scrubbed from official memory. Because when a king is the rapist, who dares to speak, 23/07/5, 15 p.m. Zainbai, to understand the grotesque reign of Ferdinand Roman VII, we must first understand the Spain he ruled, a broken empire still bleeding from war, revolution, and betrayal. Born in 1784 to Charles Roman IV, Ferdinand ascended the throne not through honor but through manipulation. He usurped his own father, stoking revolts, whispering into the ears of generals, turning court against court. The Napoleonic Wars followed, and Ferdinand, weak and greedy, willingly sold his kingdom's sovereignty to France before being dethroned and imprisoned. He returned to power in 1814, greeted as El Decido, the desired one. But the people's desire would rot in their mouths. Ferdinand immediately repealed the liberal constitution of 1812, reinstating absolute monarchy. Censorship returned. The Inquisition, long dormant, stirred again. Dissenters were imprisoned, tortured, exiled. But behind closed palace doors, the tyranny turned inward, more intimate. It was not enough to crush revolutionaries. He wanted control over flesh. He married 4 times, each wife younger and more submissive than the last. The third, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, was so traumatized by her wedding night that she refused to be alone with Ferdinand for years. Rumors claimed she attempted suicide. Ferdinand's appetite did not fade with age. In fact, it grew darker. Whispers emerged from the palace of underground rooms, of girls procured from orphanages, convents, even peasant villages, brought in as offerings. Ferdinand's physicians documented his worsening illness, genital lesions, bouts of madness, paranoia. Yet nothing, and no one, was ever allowed to challenge his authority. His perversions, protected by power, were dismissed as royal eccentricities. But the truth is far more sinister. 23/07/5, 15 p.m. Zainbai. There were no dungeons in Ferdinand Roman VII's palace, not in the traditional sense. No dripping stone walls, no iron cages. His instruments of torture were softer, quieter, more elegant, and that made them infinitely more cruel. Beneath the royal bedchamber of the Palacio Real in Madrid, a hidden corridor snaked beneath marble floors. Behind its velvet-lined walls were rooms that bore no official name, though servants called them La Capilla Roja, the Red Chapel. There the king's chosen guests were prepared. Girls, some as young as 12, were brought in under the pretext of education or religious training. Many were orphans, some were daughters of minor nobles trading their children for favor. All were silenced. First came the cleansing, a ritualistic scrubbing by palace midwives under strict instructions from the king. Hot water, harsh soap, bleeding skin, hair trimmed to a uniform style, perfume applied until the girls could hardly breathe. Their old clothing was burned. In its place, lace corsets, silk slippers, and a thin white gown. Virgin white, then the staging. Each girl was made to wait alone in a cold chamber, seated on a velvet chair in front of a large mirror. Hours would pass, no food, no water, just silence until the lock clicked and 2 guards entered. They were forbidden to speak. They simply escorted her to the king's chamber, room 17, west wing, upper gallery. There, Ferdinand awaited in a silk robe and a wooden chair bolted to the floor. The rituals were grotesquely theatrical. He demanded obedience, silence, and total submission. If the girl cried, she was gagged. If she resisted, she was strapped down to a chaise, an imported restraint couch from France. Its wood was stained from use. Iron cuffs held wrists and ankles apart. Servants, trained like stagehands, operated from behind panels in the wall, pulling levers that tilted the couch or tightened straps. Everything was orchestrated. Everything rehearsed. Ferdinand's preferred punishment was humiliation. He would force the girls to recite prayers mid-act, mocking their innocence as he defiled it. Sometimes he dressed them in nun habits. Sometimes he used holy relics as tools of shame. And when he was finished, the girl would be dragged out, not to rest, but to confess her own sins, to a court priest waiting in the corridor. The priest would write it down. Seal it, burn it, and say nothing. The next morning the girl would be sent back, or worse, vanish entirely. Those who survived were never the same. Some were returned to convents, others married off to distant lords. A few took their own lives, but the palace kept no records. These weren't crimes. They were performances, disguised as divine right, enacted behind gold-plated doors, watched by no one, and remembered by even fewer. This wasn't pleasure, it was domination. It was a king playing God, and his kingdom, afraid and complicit, bowed to it. 23/07/5, 16 p.m. Zane by. What Ferdinand Roman VII did to those girls was more than physical torment. It was a mutilation of identity, of soul. The damage didn't end when the silk ropes were untied or when the blood dried on velvet floors. It lived on, in their silences, in their trembling hands, in the way they could never look at mirrors again. And worse, it lived on in the way no one dared speak their names. Some of these girls came from poor families already broken by war and hunger. To them, the palace had seemed a miracle, a chance to serve, to rise, to escape. But what they entered was not royalty. It was a gilded slaughterhouse for innocence. One girl, named only in hidden archives as Lucia de Salamanca, was 14 when she was taken in by the Queen's lady-in-waiting. She was said to be pious, quiet, and obedient. Perfect, in Ferdinand's words. Within 2 weeks of arriving at the palace, Lucia stopped speaking. A court physician noted her symptoms: sleeplessness, violent tremors, sudden fits of weeping. The notes vanish after that, no cause listed, no treatment prescribed. She was never mentioned again. Another, Raffaella, came from a noble but destitute family. Her father offered her to the court to secure a debt. She returned home 2 years later, pale as wax, mute, and visibly pregnant. Her child was stillborn. Raffaella was institutionalized in a Franciscan asylum and died at 19. In her final days, she clawed her arms until they bled, muttering, "El trono mi vi," the throne sees me. But the sickness did not stay confined to chambers. It leaked through the kingdom's pores like rot beneath polished wood. Women in Madrid warned their daughters not to look too beautiful or too quiet, or too obedient. Midwives began falsifying ages on birth records, claiming girls were younger or older, anything to escape the king's eye. Orphanages, once considered safe havens, became markets, and the church. Silent, many priests were complicit, performing mock confessions for the abused girls, feeding Ferdinand their secrets like offerings. Others, terrified, looked away. One Jesuit, Father Alonso Navarro, fled Spain altogether. In a letter smuggled to Italy, he wrote, "There are devils in Rome, yes, but in Madrid they wear crowns." Even noblewomen felt unsafe. Ferdinand's gaze did not discriminate. Widows were forced to audition in private court receptions. If he was displeased, they were married off to cruel men as punishment. If he was pleased, they were kept. Yet no rebellion came. The people, exhausted by war and famine, turned their eyes toward bread and survival. What could a peasant do against a king when even God's own shepherds bowed? Spain, under Ferdinand, became not just a monarchy. It became a mausoleum of silence. And within that silence, the screams of hundreds of girls echoed, unheard, unrecorded, but not forgotten. Because trauma, true trauma, never vanishes, it lingers in walls, it passes through generations, and in Spain's forgotten daughters, the pain still burns. 23/07, 5:16 p.m. Zainbai, Ferdinand Roman VII died in 1833. Bloated, half, mad, and paranoid, he spent his final weeks locked inside his royal chambers, terrified of shadows that weren't there whispering about ghosts in the curtains, children at the foot of his bed, girls with burned eyes watching from the ceiling. The physicians called it fever, the priests called it penance, but those who knew better, those who had walked the halls, who had heard the muffled cries behind the red chamber doors, they said it was justice. His body was entombed in El Escorial among saints and emperors, wrapped in royal silk and Catholic rites. No mention of the girls, no mention of the velvet straps. History closed the door, but evil doesn't die with the man who birthed it. It lingers, in rooms, in families, in systems built to protect power, not people. After his death, Spain did not erupt in reform. His young daughter, Isabella Roman II, took the throne under a regency, but the rot had already spread. The monarchy continued, the church tightened its silence, and the nation stumbled into deeper instability. Civil wars, coups, more kings, more shadows. The red chapel beneath the palace was sealed, but not destroyed. For decades, palace servants whispered of strange sounds at night. The clinking of chains, the faint creak of furniture that hadn't been used in years. Some claimed to see a pale girl walking the West Wing halls in silence. Of course, the historians dismiss this, they always do, but sometimes. Truth lingers in the places academia dares not go. Today, Ferdinand is remembered, if at all, as an incompetent tyrant, a monarch who betrayed his people politically. The textbooks talk about his failure to defend the Constitution, his cowardice during Napoleon's invasion. They mention his personal eccentricities as footnotes, euphemisms, sanitized lies. But in truth, he was a predator in silk, a man who weaponized God, power, and monarchy to break bodies and erase souls. He didn't just molest girls, he molested an entire nation's sense of innocence, faith, and trust. And what of the victims? No statues bear their names, no plaques hang in Madrid. Their stories live only in whispers, in half-burned letters, in forbidden archives locked behind Vatican keys. The world moved on. As it always does, but maybe it shouldn't, because the story of Ferdinand Roman VII is not just about one man. It's about how systems protect monsters, how power erases pain, how a crown can become a mask, hiding not majesty but madness. And maybe most terrifying of all is how little we've learned. As you walk through royal palaces, gaze at oil portraits, or read tales of kings and court, remember what was hidden just beneath the marble. Remember the screams behind the velvet. Remember Lucia, remember Rafaela, and remember, history forgets, but pain remembers always.